Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me on the I Am Barabbas podcast. We continue on with our weekly Torah reading studies in the book of Genesis. We're looking this week at the story of Joseph, a young Joseph, as he enters into the land of Egypt as a slave, as he was sold by his brothers. We also have a story about Judah that's also shared with us in Genesis chapter 38. As you can see, the complete listings of the readings there on the screens: Genesis chapter 37 through chapter 40, Amos chapter 2, verse 6 through chapter 3, verse 8, Zechariah chapter 2, verse 10 through chapter 4, verse 7, and then Acts chapter 7, 9 through 16. Now, I want to start with looking at a passage from the book of Genesis, but not in Genesis chapter 37, but all the way back in Genesis chapter 15. In Genesis chapter 15, we have the story it's told about God creating his covenant with Abram. If you remember the story, God puts Abram to sleep, and then he, does all the ceremony of going through the animals that were cut in half, a symbolic gesture to show, whoever fails to keep up with the terms of this covenant may they end up like the animals that are dead here. And God, by putting Abram to sleep and being the only one to walk through the animals, was indicating that he would only hold himself accountable to keep this covenant. And part of that covenant is a promise to Abraham, or at least a revelation to Abraham about what's going to happen to future generations as after he passes on. So in verse 13 of chapter 15, Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, it says, "Then he said to Abram, know for certain that your seed will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I am going to judge the nation that they will serve, and afterward they will go out with many possessions." And so this week's readings are the beginnings of the fulfillment of this prophecy to Abram by God. And so let's go ahead and look at the story, because as if you did the reading, you hopefully saw that it revolves around Joseph and the time that his brothers sold him into Egypt. And so when God first said that to Abram, I'm sure Abram was like, well, how is that going to happen? How are my descendants, like as it says here, verse 13 of chapter 15, how are they going to end up in another land that's not theirs? How are they going to end up enslaved and oppressed? How is that all going to happen? Well, now we're going to see how exactly that takes place, how that is fulfilled in the life of Joseph. So, as I mentioned earlier, the name of this week's reading is "And He Settled," and so it's a direct reflection of the first verse of the first passage of the reading. It says, "Now Jacob dwelled in the land where his father had sojourned, in the land of Canaan." And it's a significant step. If you've been following along, hopefully you remember Jacob had been avoiding living in Canaan ever since he ran away from the land because of his brother's threats against him. Then he finally makes his way back, and as we start in this chapter, so the last chapter, told us where Esau ended up settling in Seir, where his family lineage started to grow, and just that he was not in the promised land. And now we get word that Jacob has finally settled in the promised land, and the generations of Jacob are also dwelling there. And so it starts off, though, with telling us about Joseph. And Joseph, it tells us in the very beginning in verse 2 that he would bring back bad reports about his brothers to his father. So as I read that, I was like, yeah, okay, that's not great. A great thing to be known of, especially someone who's from Miami. We don't like, we use the term snitch to describe someone who's like a tattletale, or someone who tells on other people. And I'm sure that's used in other parts of the country, but that phrase, but yeah, it's not a good thing to be labeled as a snitch or to be labeled as a tattletale. But it seems like this is what Joseph was doing. Like, this is just part of who he was. He was 17 years old. He would go see what his brothers were doing, and then he'd go back and tell his dad, like, "Hey, Dad, guess what? So and so did." And if you know anything about siblings and just people in general, don't tend to like it when other people are going around talking about the things we do to someone else, especially in a way where they're kind of telling on you and they want you to get in trouble. It's not cool to be that way or to have that kind of thing going on. But it says in verse 3 that despite so Joseph has this like unique relationship with Israel, and that Israel, remember, Israel's just another name for Jacob. His name was changed, right? So Israel loved Joseph more than his other sons because he was son of his old age. We also know that Joseph was the first son of only two by the woman he loved more than anybody else, and that was Rachel. There has to be a connection with that. It's like, Rachel, this is my firstborn son from the wife that I loved, and this is Joseph, and so he loves him more. Says he's the son of his old age, whatever it might be. Like, oh, he's an old man, and now this is like his younger son, and so or his first son as he's getting older, and so he's changing. I don't know, whatever it might be. It's obvious that there's a problem in the dynamic with which Israel is raising his sons. For them to know that dad loves someone else more than he loves us is problematic. You never want your kids to come away with that kind of like feeling or understanding about their standing in the relationship with their parents, that they're loved more, cared for more than another child. And that's really also a big problem with blended families. You have different wives and different kids, and who's the favorite, who's not, and it's easier also in those situations to do that. But anyway, the social commentary, it's definitely a problem because in verse 4 it says, so he gives his son a special, this version says a long sleeve tunic. It's a ornamented coat. Whatever, it just means it was decorated. It wasn't just this plain drab like brown color or gray or like linen that's been may come out like off white but then end up being dirty later because of dirt and dust and stuff like that. It was something that had dye in it, so it was expensive for that to, most likely it was really expensive for that to be that way, and so he gave that to Joseph. And as a result, it says in the scripture that the brothers all hated him and they couldn't speak to him in peace. And why? Because they saw that their father loved him more. And so as we look at the dynamics here between, this is 10 sons with the 11th Joseph. The youngest one is Benjamin. He's not in the picture yet in terms of storytelling. He's really not just included. You have these older 10 brothers who are just looking at one of the youngest brothers, the son of the wife that they all know that Jacob loved more than any of their moms. And then they see the favoritism. All that builds up with this resentment and bitterness and anger. And it straight up tells us that they hated him and they couldn't even speak to him in peace. I don't know if you've ever been so angry with somebody that you couldn't even talk to them cordially, just like short, curt answers. Yeah, I know some of you must definitely, know what that's like. You just can't speak to someone in peace because you dislike them so much. And that was the condition that the relationship was of Joseph and his brothers. Not a good one. And following all that, Joseph dreams a dream. And hope you remember, I think it was last week or the week before, I shared the verse out of Numbers and where God tells, he's talking to Miriam and Aaron and Moses, and he says, the prophets, the people I speak to in visions and dreams. And to Moses, I spoke face to face. So what he was telling Aaron and Miriam was, Moses is special to me. And this was after they were kind of complaining about Moses' leadership and his relationship to God. But in that passage in the book of Numbers, what God was also doing, though, was just defining the method in which he communicates to people. He gives people dreams. He gives people visions. We call those people prophets, and then those prophets speak. By Joseph having this dream, which is a really obvious dream, it's not something, but both dreams are really obvious in their interpretation and meaning. And how do I know that? Because it's not just because I've read this story so many times since I was a kid, and probably most of us have seen Joseph in the multicolored coat or whatever, Bible stories and animated shorts or whatever. So it's not just that, seeing all that in the past, and so I know the answer. You can read in the text the response that the brothers have to hearing the content of the dream themselves is one of anger and hatred and jealousy, because they understand that what he's telling them is that one day they're all going to be bowing to him. That's the content of his dreams. In verse 5, listen to this dream I dreamed. I was binding sheaves in the middle of the field. All of a sudden, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed to mine. So their response, "Are you going to be king over us?" And says, and I highlighted there so you can see it more clearly. So they hated him even more because of his dreams and because of his words. Now, this is an important theme for this week's readings. The idea that God speaks through people in visions and dreams, and then those people have a responsibility to speak out, about the things that they saw in their dream, to share their dreams, and then for that truth from those dreams to be communicated to the people, whether or not they want to hear it or not. In fact, when we look at our passage in Amos later, we're going to see how the nation of Israel essentially does what these 10 brothers are doing. If you remember that these 10 brothers, they represent the nation of Israel. Well, Judah is technically not supposed to be part of that, but they kind of represent in the story and the context and the theme of the entire, the book of Genesis and where we're going. They do represent, those tribes and those parts of Israel that don't want to listen or don't want to obey. Remember, the oldest, Reuben, he tried to, sleep with his father's concubine, and that was him usurping his father's authority. Not a good thing. It's a symbol of later issues with the nation of Israel. Then you had Simeon and Levi just going above and beyond what was necessary to be brutal and kill a whole town of people. And in that violence, there's also depicted a problem that you're going to have with the nation of Israel, just like this violence that is talked about in the scripture. And it seems like, oh, this comes from God. This is what God wants them to do. God wants them to wipe out every child and kill everybody. And there's definitely some struggle with interpretations there, but they definitely represent that excess. And then you have Judah and his whole thing, so which we'll look at later in his failures as well. But their reaction to his dreams, what I'm trying to say is that their reaction to his dreams and they're true. It's not like he's controlling them or he's dreaming them because he's some malignant narcissist. He's dreaming them because God is giving him those dreams, or this dream and the next dream, and it's God speaking through the dream so that the prophet can then say what it is that he saw, and so people can then understand what it is that God is trying to say. And what God is trying to tell them is that Joseph will indeed be elevated to a place, a position of power, as such that will lead them to bow before them. Instead of saying, wow, how is that going to happen? Is there some way we can prevent this? Which I've learned recently is really interesting with prophecy. There's like the negative and the positive, and the negative is always conditional. It's like, if you do this or that and the other, then this is going to happen. But it gives you leeway to be able to not do that thing so that the negative consequence that's tied to the prophecy doesn't happen. And so certainly this prophecy revolves around famine and them worshiping Joseph, but it becomes true because they sell him into slavery. So could they have figured out, like, hey, what does this dream mean? Okay, we're going to serve you. How is that going to happen? No, brother, we're never going to sell you. We don't want you to ever leave us. We love you. And all that kind of, maybe they would have prevented all of that from happening. Because sometimes God will do that. He will speak through a prophet in a way to, again, with negative prophecies that have just negative consequences, he will speak in a way that'll help people avoid those pathways so that something else can happen. Now, he has a second dream. It's very similar. He says that to his brothers. This time his father hears the dream, and it says that he rebukes him. He's like, what is this dream? Are we really going to, worship you? And it says his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the speech in mind. So the initial reaction of Israel, the father, Jacob, was, what are you saying? Right? And I understand that. I think that's really natural. Like, what kind of dream is this? You're telling me that we're all going to come worship you? But then you start to think about it, and then what? Right? Is God trying to tell me something? Is something can something be done? Like, what exactly does it mean? Interpretations and stuff like that are important. So the brothers, though, they just end up with hatred. Now, as the story continues, it tells us that the brothers at some point go to graze at Shechem. And if you remember with Shechem, we had that massacre I mentioned earlier, the killing of all the men that the Simeon and Levi did, just the two of them. It was actually the first place that Abram went to when he first came to Canaan. It's where Jacob returns from Haran to. Then that's where that, I call it the foreskin massacre, happens. And then Jacob buries all the idols at a tree at Shechem. And so actually, because of the massacre, the foreskin massacre, the rabbis have always associated Shechem then afterwards with just tragedy or evil. And so it kind of fits in with now what's going to happen with Joseph, right? So that he goes to see them. He doesn't actually find them there. The story starts there, and then he finds some guy, tells him where they went on. They went to Dothan. I'm going to show a map later so we can kind of see all these places. But he says he saw from a distance, and then they saw him coming from a distance, probably because he's got his shiny coat on, and they could tell that he's walking, and oh, there he comes. And so they plot to kill him. And yet Reuben, the oldest, who has, by trying to sleep with his father's concubine, but then not, removing his father, is kind of like, where am I in the place of the eldership with my brothers? It's clear that in terms of leadership, when you make a move like that, you're going to lose face. You're going to lose power. You're going to lose your ability to really have any influence later on. And so Reuben tries, and he does succeed in saving Joseph's life, but he has to do it in a way where he feels like he's not being completely honest. So he quotes the phrase, "Don't shed blood." It's got to be a reference back to Noah, and remember the covenant that God made with Noah after the ark, and just like this new law that God gave, like if a man kills another man, his blood will be shed also. And the idea, even going back to Cain and Abel, like, we do not shed blood. This is not the way of the Lord. This is not how we've been taught. Father Abraham taught Isaac, and Isaac taught our father Jacob, and then Jacob taught us, and so we don't shed blood. And so he was able to convince them to not do that, but then to throw him in a pit. And so this is where I said, as a true leader of his brothers, should have been like, no, stop it. We're not killing him. We're not hurting him at all. What's going on with you guys? I know Dad loves him a lot, but and we're all feeling that, but we can't respond by doing bad things to our brother. It's not really about him. But instead, because he doesn't have full power and authority as the eldest, because he gave that up in his attempt to usurp his father, he kind of has to negotiate a way to keep Joseph alive, and he does that. They throw him in a pit, and I want you to kind of picture this image. Joseph's in a pit, and there's not even water in it, it tells us. And then the brothers are sitting around eating and having a feast. Like, we got our brother. They sat down to eat bread. And this situation is going to be flipped around, because later on, the brothers are going to come to him with nothing, no food, no water. They're going to be begging the fulfillment of that dream, and it's going to be Joseph who's going to be feasting. And he invites them for a feast, and he's going to feast, but he's going to be the one with the power. Right now, in this moment, that's how they feel. But it's interesting in the writing, the narrative, how that's going to turn on them completely. So as they sit down and eat bread, they sell him into slavery. And there's probably questions if you've been doing the reading. It talks about Ishmaelites and it talks about Midianites. Some believe that some editor later on in time, put in the word Ishmaelites, but then the truth that it was Midianites that the brothers sold his Joseph to. The way I read it, I feel like they saw Ishmaelites. They're like, oh, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. But then they ended up giving him to Midianites because the Midianites were the next ones to come across them. Right? The Ishmaelites came and went, and then they have a discussion. And then later Midianites came. So I really don't, I haven't read anything too satisfactory about why there's different groups of people being named in terms of who they sold Joseph to. But that's just my view on it. So whatever it is, it says that they saw Ishmaelites. It's Judah who is taking the lead here. And again, remember, Judah's the fourth son. And because of what Reuben has done, what Simeon and Levi has done, it actually makes sense that now Judah is the one with like the leadership amongst the brothers. He's the fourth oldest, but he's also the one that hasn't messed up yet. And I think when we did the lesson on Simeon and Levi and what Reuben did, I looked at the blessing that Israel gives to all of his sons. And if you remember, it was Judah that he gives the blessing for kingship. Like he says, the scepter will not leave the house of Judah. It's going to remain with Judah. And that was an indication of Israel saying, like, the firstborn rights and everything else goes to my fourth-born son. Not surprising with Jacob, who was himself second-born, even if it was just a few seconds apart. But still, it's kind of become a theme now throughout the stories. And we're going to see that with Judah's life in chapter 38 as well, and his two sons. So Judah comes up with this plan. They sell Joseph. They sell him for 20 pieces of silver. And when Reuben comes back, he's freaking out because he says, where did my brother go? And they slaughter a goat and they put the tunic on it with blood and they give it to the dad. And so the dad, and they see the way that Israel mourns the loss of his son. They convince him that his son is dead. And so he mourns his son. It says he mourns him for many days. And they try to console him. He refused to be comforted. And he kept weeping. And that's where it says at the end of verse 36 that the Midianites sold him into Egypt. So the brothers get a full view, impact of what it was for Israel to lose his son and how much he actually loved his son. And that's going to come into play later in the story. But just to look at now this kind of viewpoint of Joseph being betrayed by his brothers, sold for 20 pieces of silver, a concept that I never really knew about until a couple of years ago when I started reading more like messianic commentaries and just trying to study the scriptures with different light and different views, trying to expand my knowledge base so that I can make what I feel like is the most honest understanding of what the scripture is trying to say in my own head and try to teach that as well. I learned that there's actually been for a very long time two schools of thought about the Messiah, that there was Messiah, son of David, which is the one most Christians are familiar with. I mean, probably all of us. It's the phrase that you hear all the time. The book of Matthew is focused on proving this idea that Jesus is the son of David, that he is the Messiah, the son of David. And so, okay, there's that. But then there's also another view of the Messiah, son of Joseph. And the way that Jewish eschatology works, in my best understanding, and so if anybody who's like a scholar of that and I get it wrong, I apologize, but I just did a cursory search and look up and wrote some notes down. It seems that they have this view, and I probably should just make sure I read it. It says, a suffering warrior Messiah who precedes and paves the way for the Messiah, son of David. So he's a separate Messiah. He's not the same person. He's a suffering warrior Messiah who precedes and paves the way for the Messiah, son of David. So the Messiah, son of David, is one who comes and reigns. Right? He comes victorious and he reigns. But the son of Joseph is like the one who does the dirty work, the one who suffers in order to bring the salvation of Israel, which is what Joseph ends up doing. Right? He ends up suffering. He's sold into slavery. He's the rest of the story that connects with him, and there's like a little interlude with Judah. And then it goes to 39 and 40 where it picks up back with Joseph, where he's with Potiphar and Potiphar's wife, wants to sleep with him and all that stuff. And then he goes to prison. And so all of his ordeal, his suffering, it paves the path to the salvation of Israel. Because without him going through that, without him suffering the way he did, being betrayed at the hands of his brothers, sold into slavery, thrown into prison, falsely accused, right? All of this stuff, without having experienced that, he wouldn't have risen to such a high position in Egypt, so that when his brothers come for food, when there's famine in their land, he's able to save them. He's able to give them food, and he's able to provide for them, and then he's able to get his father in and then provide a place for the entire nation to grow and they get their own land and Goshen and everything else. And so Joseph's suffering leads to salvation for the nation of Israel. And so that's one concept of the Messiah. The second concept of the Messiah is related to, kingship and David and ruling. And so when I learned this stuff and started connecting it, I realized, okay, so this is what they believe. They believe that there's going to first be a Messiah, son of Joseph, who's going to suffer and everything else, and then the son of David. But certainly as followers of Yeshua, we can see that he is, or his first coming, I should say, his first coming was the fulfillment of the idea of the Messiah, son of Joseph, betrayed by his brothers, sold to a foreign nation, sold to the Romans, sold to the leadership, and betrayed, and then given over to a foreign nation. He was put up on a cross. He suffered and endured suffering, great suffering, and he suffered to the point of death. A more extreme version of what happened to Joseph. And yet, without his death, he wouldn't have been able to rise again. And without his resurrection, there is no power and victory over sin, over death, over hell, and then the salvation, the redemption of Israel. Not only Israel, but of all the world. And then we're going to look later at the book of Zechariah and the prophecies there, but without the sufferings of Jesus, the entire earth, all of humanity, all the clans of the earth would have been doomed. And so Jesus' first coming, certainly for Messianic Jews, Jesus fulfilled that role as the Messiah, son of Joseph. And I know there are Jewish scholars who do not believe in Jesus as Messiah, and they would argue against that, and they have their points, and all is fair with that. That's fine. I don't mean to argue. This is the faith that I have. This is the belief that I have about who Yeshua is. He is the Messiah of God, and then he himself spoke about returning. And so one thing that the Jewish eschatology also has, different from the belief that the Christian faith has, is that Jesus is both Messiah, is that he had two coming, that he was going to be appearing twice, first as the son of Joseph, then as the son of David, which the Jewish eschatology almost has exactly as well. They just thought of it as two different people, or they think of it, I should say, as two different people, but Jesus fulfills them both by resurrecting and going back to the Father and then promising to return. That's where we see him fulfill the second part of the Messiahship, and that's being the son of David, the lion of the tribe of Judah, the branch, the servant, the capstone, all the stuff that was in the book of Zechariah. So that's the beginning part of this story in Genesis chapter 37. As we move on into Genesis chapter 38, we see the narrative break free from Joseph and focus on Judah. And what does Judah do after this whole thing? You see dad crying, wah, wah, wah. It's not just wah, wah, wah. It's like heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to see a parent cry that way. Doesn't matter if you care for them much or not. And it says that they hated their brother. They didn't hate their dad. Right? And they can make that distinction. It's like, oh, I hate that guy. Dad loves him so much. He leaves. He leaves down and he camps near an Edomite man whose name was Hira. So this is where I want to pull up this map. And I think I have it here. Pull this up. Yep. Okay. So, that's pretty small for you. So we're going to zoom in. Always tricky working with these kinds of apps and screen recording and stuff, because you never know. Okay, so you see there Adullam, right? It's right there, the little flag. There's a trail there that's also being shown. Just above that, Akizib, which is going to be mentioned later in this chapter, I think just in verse 5. You see Shechem is way over here, and Dothan. So Shechem, we have there. That's where Joseph went to go find his brothers. He was told that they were up in Dothan. So that's where he goes to find them, and that's where he's put into a pit, and then he's sold. And that's what this map is just showing, the traveling of Joseph. And so if I just come back to here, though, so from this area, they go back to Hebron, because Hebron is where Israel is, where Jacob is living. So they go back down there because he's mourning the loss of his son. And then it says that Judah goes ahead up to Adullam. So he just goes up to there. Now, I want to point out that Adullam is actually a very important place in the narrative of the Bible. You're going to see this. I think this is the first time we're seeing it mentioned. That's why I was just going ahead and showing it and talking about it. It's one of the Canaanites. So if you remember, like with Shechem, Canaan was a city-state type land. Like you had separate cities that were their own states with their own kings, and they might unify together to fight against somebody, like messengers. Hey, we need help here. And like Lord of the Rings, like with the Rohirrim and Men of Gondor, and they had their own places, right? And then they would call each other for help to fight, that kind of thing. So Canaan was just a bunch of city-states gathered just together like that. Adullam was one of those places where there was a king, and there was there was like royalty there, and it was an important city. And later in the narrative of the Bible, David ends up hiding there when he's running away from Saul, the caves of Adullam, and then it's associated with like the Philistines. It's just like right there on the border there with the Philistine territory and Saul's battles, and even Goliath and the whole thing. The valley is like nearby. So just for historical purposes, this is actually a really important place. It's really close to what's going to later become Judea. It's like on the outskirts of that. So it's also tied into, so Judah's going down there. He's still in the land, the promised land of Canaan, and he's actually going down into the portion of the land that's going to be his tribe's land later on, years later, when they come back to settle in the land. But he makes a big mistake. It's a mistake because we know that it's something that Abraham was against, and then in the narrative, we know that they're always against the idea. You remember, Abraham sent his servant to go get a wife for his son Isaac that wasn't a Canaanite, and so that kind of was indicative of the fact that he knew the kind of people that lived in Canaan, and he didn't want his son to marry into that. That's what it was, right? It's not just some kind of racist type thing. No, he knew the people, and he said, I don't want my son to get married into this kind of family, because then it's going to lead to trouble later on in his life. And so Judah going down to this area, he's still in his land, but he marries the daughter of a Canaanite man. So he does something he probably shouldn't do. He marries somebody outside of what he probably has been taught about who he should marry, not marry. That is an assumption, but that's the idea. Jacob was also sent away to go get a wife. He was running away from his brother, but the idea was also there to go get a wife from your family. And I could also see why Jacob wouldn't send his sons over there. He did make that covenant with Laban. Anyway, I'm kind of chasing a bunny trail. He does what, I would say this. He does what the writers of the Old Testament, is Moses, the writers of the teachings of the law, of Genesis through Deuteronomy, what consensus is definitely wrong. It's something shouldn't do, and that's marry a Canaanite woman. And so he does that. She gets pregnant. She has 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. And that's where it says he was in Azib. And I showed that on the map earlier, is also the Akizir name on that map. So she gives birth to these 3 kids. And then he gets a wife for his first son named Tamar. But his first son is doing evil things in the eyes of God, and so he's put to death. Then he tells his son Onan to perform this duty of like being a kinsman redeemer. You're gonna you're going to have a son with your wife, with your brother's wife, because they didn't have any kids yet, so that we have a way to continue on the lineage of um your brother. That way he's not like wiped away from the face of the earth. This is very common practice in these days. So he uh he asks his second son to do that. His second son doesn't want to do that. He sleeps with the wife, but then his brother's wife, but then he purposely wastes his seed so that his brother's wife won't get pregnant. So in other words, he's getting to enjoy the sexual experience, but he's not doing his duty, and so he's put to death as well. And then the youngest son was just too old for Tamar to be with. He was just a young kid. So Judah promises, hey, when he gets old enough, I'll give him to you as a husband, and then you can continue on that way. But as it says, Judah's wife dies, and oh wait, Judah's reasoning was that he might die also. So I got that a little confused. So he said, "Stay as a widow in your father's house until my son grows up." Okay, he didn't want his son, because he was thinking, I don't want my son to die like his brothers, and so she went to her father's house. And then Judah's wife dies, and so he goes to console, to grieve. And Tamar puts together a plan. She's like, he hasn't given me the son that he promised. So he says, for she saw that Shelah had grown up, and she had not been given to him as a wife. So Judah said one thing, but he was meaning he didn't want to do that thing in giving that son. He's like, this girl is the problem. Both of my sons have died because of her. I'm not going to give my third son to him. That's not what was happening, but that's what he was thinking. And so she comes up with her own plan to her own scheme to get Judah to sleep with her, so that he can fulfill that responsibility of kinsman redeemer. And so she puts in this whole thing about becoming a prostitute. And I hope you read the story, but that's what happens there. She pretends to be a prostitute. He sleeps with her, but first, and then but he doesn't have like the goat to pay her with because she's a prostitute, and so he gives her like a pledge, like his cord and signet, just this thing that proves that, okay, this is me. Like giving someone, once I got into a little fender bender, and I had cash in the ATM, but not on me, and so the guy is like, okay, give me your driver's license. Then he followed me to the bank. I got the money out. I gave my driver's license back. Right. So kind of like just that kind of thing is what happened here. He gave her his seal and his cord and her staff, as like a down payment, not down payment, but just promise that you're going to pay me. And then when he came back with the goat or whatever it was that he was going to, goat, she was gone. So then he's like, oh, wait. And she did that because she knew she got pregnant. Everybody knows if she, like, wait, how'd you get pregnant? They would kill her. But then she'd be able to produce the stuff that Judah gave her. And Judah would say, okay, yeah, it was me. I thought she was something else. Okay, I'll take care of her. And that's what she did. And what I noticed, and that's what happens. So she ends up becoming the mother of his two twins. He has twins that are born that fight the same way that his father and his uncle did. And one of them becomes the line of kings. That's Perez. So the one that was supposed to be born second, but then, switched, becomes the firstborn. He becomes the progenitor of the kings of Israel. The one that was born first, that they tied a scarlet thread around and then went back in, he gets born second, and he doesn't have any like significance. And that's why this whole scarlet thread thing is there, is for us to connect him with Esau. You have Esau, remember his name meaning like red, and is speaking about the hairiness of his body and just the color of that it looked. And if you've ever seen a person with like red body hair, you know what I'm talking about. And that was Esau. And so the tie-in is between those two. There we have the two parallel twin stories, and one becoming the future of kings, and the one becoming not that. With all of that reviewed, this entire story going and then looking back at Genesis chapter 37 shows Judah to be a schemer, just like Jacob. And remember, he comes up with the plan to sell his brother into slavery and to put his brother's coat in blood and everything. And then in this situation, he goes down, he marries, then he comes up with a scheme to keep his third son from dying, and then but then ironically, he gets bested by someone else's scheme. Tamar's scheme gets him, and so that is kind of just an interesting note in literary tools used in the passages. Alrighty, so we're into chapter 39 and chapter 38. I don't want to go through it all over and over because, I mean, these stories, again, these go back to Sunday school to me, so I hope that you're all familiar with it. But Joseph is just doing well. You can take note in the first 4 verses of chapter 39 of the repetition of phrases, of these phrases. All, the word all, A-L-L, all, hand, house, blessing, succeed. When you read the book of Genesis and you see chapter 39, you see that with every indication and every proof that Joseph has God with him. Joseph is upright in his actions, and he is, so in other words, he's always doing what's right. He's always keeping in his mind God first, and as a result, he is continually being blessed and raised up in the situations he's in. He's being lifted up into higher and higher positions of authority. And the example here of how he responds to Potiphar's wife as she tries to seduce him, he says this: "How could I do this great evil and give offense to God?" And I feel like that must have been the mantra of his life. How can I do this great evil and give offense to God? And so it just feels like every time he was confronted with a choice, he would ask himself that question, and he would make sure that he did not offend God. And the fact that, again, he had everything in his hand, everything in his house, everything was, he was successful and he was blessed. It's proof of the fact that he was someone who honored God and followed his teachings and followed his ways. There's no way to get around that. The obedience and submission to God's will and authority is linked with blessing. It's not faith. It's not how much you believe in something. It's what you do with your belief. You believe that God is the God of the universe. You believe that God commanded, do not shed blood. You believe X, Y, Z about God. Okay, now, do you obey? Do you submit to that belief? Right? You can have all the faith in the world, but if you don't obey and you don't believe, it really doesn't count for anything, honestly. So, as the story goes on, she continues to bother him. He continues to make the same decision. How can I commit this great evil and sin against God? How can I commit this great evil and sin against God? So she tries to grab him and essentially force him to do what she wants to do. He runs out of the house. She screams. She perfectly frames him as somebody who tried to attack her. And of course, as often happens in the scripture, like as you're looking at the life of righteous men, they end up again, as they try to live this righteous life, they end up again falling into a pit of just despair. And that's kind of an important thing to understand. The righteous is not always going to be a happy life. You're going to see blessing. Joseph has it, but then it leads to like more suffering for him. And certainly our Lord Jesus is a depiction of that as well. And so he gets arrested. He's thrown into prison. The chapter ends with Joseph being extended kindness and favor in there as well. And so what that's telling us is that despite this negative thing that happened to Joseph, God is still looking out for him. God is still blessing him. And God still, it says Adonai made whatever he did successful. And then we get to the final chapter, and that's the chapter about the dreams. Again, I feel like these are really familiar stories, but you had a cupbearer and a baker who, it says, offended their master. What does that mean if you're not sure? somebody tried to poison the king. And it was either the cupbearer or the baker. Pharaoh didn't know who, so he puts them both in prison. And just like you might see in movies or whatever, there's taste testers. Okay, go ahead, taste my wine, taste it. And okay, now taste the food. Okay, and then the guy dies. Is like, wait, what's going on here? Somebody poisoned my wine, or did he poison the bread? They probably should have different tasters for different things, but that didn't happen, and so he put them both into custody, into the prison, and they both dreamed a dream. And we're going to get back to the concept of dreams. So Joseph makes some really important concepts for us to understand about dreams and who interprets them and where they come from. It says, why your face is so sad? It says, we dreamed a dream and there's no one to interpret it. So Joseph said to them, don't interpretations belong to God? Please tell me. And this is so vital to understand that when it comes to dreams and the dreams that regard as prophecies, and I have my degree in psychology, my master's degree. I know a lot about dreams. I know a lot about the natural function of dreams. I know a lot about the processing and the memory encoding and so on and so forth. And so I know that not every dream we have is something that comes from God. When what they're talking about here, what we're talking about here, are those dreams that when you have them, this is something different. It's like someone is trying to tell you something, or there's a message coming across to you. And when we have those types of dreams, it sits with us. You wake up in the morning, you remember it, and you're just like, yeah, well, what does that mean? And one of the most important things that has to happen after those dreams are had is for the person to speak regarding those dreams, to talk about it with others. Right? And in this story, what we have is these guys are like down and dejected because Joseph's kind of like in charge of the prison now. He's a prisoner, but he's also in charge. He's encouraging them to tell him the dream. And so the first guy tells him, and the dream is there. You can read it. And Joseph says, this is the interpretation. And what Joseph is saying is, okay, God gave you this dream. You're telling it to me. Now God is making it clear to me what this dream means. And so he tells him in 3 days, Pharaoh's going to lift you up. You're going to return back to where you came from. Show kindness to me. Remember me. I was forcibly kidnapped from the land of Hebrews, and they shouldn't have put me into this pit. It's kind of interesting. He's like twice he's been thrown into a pit. The chief baker saw that was a good interpretation. So he's like, oh, let me go ahead and share my dream. So he shares his, but yikes, his dream wasn't so good. Like in another 3 days, Pharaoh's going to lift your head up off of you. So in other words, in 3 days, Pharaoh's going to figure out it was the baker, not the cupbearer. So it's the baker who's the one who, the baker is the one who poisoned me. And I was just thinking, probably blamed the cupbearer because he brought him the food. So not because it was wine. I don't know. Yeah. So I don't know. Yeah. Because I always assumed that it was wine that he brought him, and so they didn't know which one. So anyway, I'll just stick with that. Either way, it could be either way. But the point is that Joseph then interprets this dream, and both of these dreams, both of these interpretations are proven to be true. But the cupbearer doesn't remember Joseph. It says, indeed, he forgot him. Now, because you know the rest of the story, he's going to eventually remember him. And I always kind of see it as God waiting for the right time to reveal Joseph and to bring Joseph up from where he's at. Like right at this moment is not that time, not that moment. But you can understand that Joseph in that time would just be like, oh, this guy forgot me or whatever. But it's just going to set up the rest of the story in the moment when the cupbearer does remember with the Pharaoh. And you can see the next chapter for next week's reading, how that starts off. Now I want to go into the book of Amos and look at what is said here and tie it together with the reading. And then just quickly look at Zechariah and then close out with the passage from Acts. So in the beginning of the passage from Amos chapter 2, starting in verse 6, God is speaking against the crimes of Israel. If you remember, this book is written way later. This is after Egypt, and after they go into the land, and after they've conquered everything, and after King David, and after King Solomon, and right, this is centuries later. But you can see tie-ins with the stories that we just read. As for 3 crimes of Israel, even for 4, I will not relent. They sell the righteous for silver, the needy for a pair of shoes. That's what happened to Joseph, and it's still happening at the time Amos is prophesying. The righteous, just person is being sold. The poor person is being trampled, it says. A man and his father go to the same girl. What Judah did with Tamar, so he was out schemed, he was tricked into this, and he went into that relationship, and he had 2 sons, and sure, one of the sons becomes the one that the line of kings come from, including David. But one thing that I'm learning is that unless the scripture says that God like approved of this thing, the silence of God's voice or opinion about anything usually doesn't mean acceptance. What I was trying to say earlier is like, unless it says and God saw this was good, don't assume that. That's what I was trying to say. Unless it says that clearly, like God saw this was good, God approved it, God blessed it, like we saw at the beginning of chapter 39 with Joseph, everything was going well with him. Unless we see clear indications, don't assume that the stories that you're reading are all things that's like approved by God in whatever's happening. We don't have to believe it's disapproved either, but it's more likely than not something he wants to see happen. And with Judah and Tamar and here, like the man and the father go to the same girl. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, like a son is gone with his father's wife. And it's not about like sleeping with the same mom, but it's about sleeping with the same person that both people have had. This is something that God doesn't want to see happen. And so in the book of Amos, it's laid out like this is also something that's happening then. A man and his father go to the same girl. Usually it's because of a cult like prostitute type thing. And what Judah was looking for was you have these cults that, oh, we worship this God, and one of the ways we offer sacrifices to this God is we have sex, and here's the prostitute, and so she's like like a priestess or whatever, and you sleep with her and you give money to her and she gives that to the God, and it's just advanced way of pimping, really. But that's kind of how that happens. So the man and his father go to the same girl to profane my holy name. That's the link, to profane. So they're worshiping other gods and doing this thing. Upon garments taken in pledge, they stretch out beside every altar. Remember how in pledge he gave his scarlet, his cord and his staff, whatever. So it's like people give a pledge of clothes. Here's my shirt. I promise I'll pay you back. But they take that stuff and they stretch it out beside the altars. They drink wine that's compensated as fines. Who told them to do that? So in other words, they're just living extremely unrighteous lives where they are taking advantage of people and poverty and in an unjust way. And God reminds them that he's the one that cut down the Amorites, who had height like cedar, so it was really tall, the giants and everything else. He's the one that brought them out of the land of Egypt. Look what he says in verse 11. I raised up prophets from your sons and Nazarites from your young men. The Nazarites were people that they would make a vow, and the vow would be like they were going to cut their hair. They weren't going to drink alcohol. They symbolized in their life the ultimate like holiness of God within the community. If you saw a Nazarite, you're like, wow, look at the Nazarite. Look how he's dedicated to God, and they're kind of a picture of. I raised up prophets from your son. But what did they do? They gave the Nazarites wine to drink, and they commanded the prophets, saying, do not prophesy. And by throwing Joseph into a pit, essentially the brothers were saying that. The brothers were saying, shut up. We don't want to hear God speak. Anytime someone is speaking and God is speaking through them, there's a choice that the listener has to make. And that's whether or not they're going to take heed of what's being said, or if they're going to demand that the person who's speaking shuts up. In this moment in history, in the book of Amos, also going back to the very beginning with Joseph, You see a pattern that people are more likely to tell the prophets to shut up. If we see with the Lord Jesus, as we're going to see with the passage from the book of Acts. God says in verse 13 that there's going to be a sudden stop and everything's going to happen. It's like when a cart that's full of sheaves stops. Sheaves like grain just stops, and they fall forward because of sudden stop. There's going to be a sudden stop. We're going to see it. And you flipped around what I've given you. The Nazarites, the prophets, they're supposed to be symbols of holiness, and they're supposed to speak on behalf of God, but you've told them to drink, and they got drunk, and you told them to shut up, and then you've killed them. What I'm going to do is your mighty won't have their power. Those who are swift, they won't be fast anymore. They're failed. The warrior, he won't be able to save his life. The archer won't stand. The fleet-footed will not escape. The horseman won't save himself. And the valiant will flee naked. So everything that you consider to be important, I'm going to flip them on their heads the same way you flipped what I think is important on its head. Okay, so that's what he's going to do to them. And continuing on in chapter 3, he makes clear, he says, you're the only clan from all the earth that I made myself known to. So you're the one that I'm going to hold the most accountable. That's verse 2. And then verses 3 through 6, they talk about the natural courses of cause and effect in human affairs and in nature. Right? So in verse 3, can two walk together unless they meet by appointment? Cause and effect in human affairs. Two people get together, they walk along the same path. They go this because they've scheduled, right? They've scheduled that. Does a lion roar in the forest when he has no prey? When does a lion roar? Like naturally, cause and effect. That's what this is. A bunch of rhetorical questions pointing to the truth of there's a natural order to cause and effect in both human affairs and in nature. And that concludes with verse 7, where he says, for the Lord Adonai will do nothing unless he has revealed his counsel to his servants, the prophets. So in the spiritual realm, what's the cause and effect? You have people dreaming dreams that's caused by God. The effect, they speak on God's behalf. You have a dream from God and you speak on God's behalf. And then verse 8 just kind of goes back to using the same poetry. So verse 7 is kind of seen as actually an interjection, like an editorial note added here to help understand the poem. So if you were to take that out, like verse 6 would flow into verse 7. A lion has roared, who will not fear? My Lord Adonai has spoken, who shall not prophesy? It does kind of make sense. So you have this like poem that's written, and so verse 7 is just an explanation of what the conclusion of the poem is in verse 8, which we've just discussed. And so God is saying, I am going to speak. I'm going to speak, and I'm going to speak, and I'm going to speak. And you can try to stop my speaking all you want, but that's not going to work. I'm going to continue to speak. And one of the ways he speaks is through dreams. He gives his prophets dreams. They dream dreams. They see the things, and then they speak what God has told them. Other ways it happens, other people dream dreams, and God gives the interpretation of what that dream is. And that's why, like I said earlier, it's important. You have these dreams, these moments. It's important to talk them through with people. Even if you don't, you feel weird about it, you don't think, and I'm talking to the believers now, like if you have had dreams and you're like, yeah, I've had these dreams and I don't know what they mean, but they do feel important, always write them down. I always journal my dreams, the significant ones. And then I will talk about it with my wife. My daughter's used to hearing me talk about my dreams as well. And then we try to figure out, like, what does it mean, if it means anything. And sometimes just like, oh yeah, you know what? I watched like a weird movie and it was that. Oh, you know what I did? I saw this. I was talking to someone else the other day and I think that was just part of that. And there are also those moments where those dreams come through and it's just like, man, God is telling me something right now. So I need to pray about this and I need to act on it in the way that he wants me to. Now to tie it all together, why Acts chapter 7, verse 9, if you don't know the context here, so our New Testament portion, right? We always look there as well. It's where Stephen is talking. Stephen is considered like, the first martyr outside of the Lord Jesus. And Stephen is stoned to death at the end of this speech. And what Stephen is doing is he's kind of like recounting all of the history of Israel. Right? He starts speaking, and it goes back to Abraham and Mesopotamia and just everything else, which actually kind of cool because remember, I think I said in previous videos, I thought Abraham's father might have been called to leave, and then he didn't go all the way, and then Abram was called the rest of the way. But according to Stephen's opening uh, part of his diatribe here, he says that Abraham was the one that was called, and they just settled, and then he waited, and then he left. So it's, that's different from what I was thinking. But anyway, he gets to in verse 8, talks about the circumcision. And then in verse 9, he says, the patriarchs became jealous of Joseph and sold him into Egypt, yet God was with him. He rescued him out of all his troubles, granted him favor and wisdom before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who made him governor over Egypt and all his household. We'll see that next week. Famine and great suffering came over all Egypt and Canaan, and our fathers could find no food. But when Jacob heard there was grain in Egypt, he sent our fathers there for the first time. On the second visit, Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and his family became known to Pharaoh. So Joseph sent and called for Jacob and all his relatives, 75 persons. Jacob went down to Egypt and died, and our fathers, and they were carried to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham had bought for a sum of money from the sons of Hamor in Shechem. So Stephen is recounting this, and this was the portion that was assigned for this week's reading from the New Testament. And I thought, why? Okay, it just retells the story. It doesn't really explain anything new. It just retells the story. It even goes further than what we're reading Genesis. So I went ahead and read the entire chapter. And when I got to the end is when I realized, oh, this is what Stephen was doing. By recounting that story and just going through the whole history in general. He goes through, you saw how long it is. This is 50 something verses of this guy just talking. Actually, it's 52, 53 verses. He's just talking and talking and talking and talking. He's recounting this entire story, kind of like what I do with this podcast, right? So I appreciate those who stay with it. And he gets to the end of his little message or his speech, and he talks about how David wanted to build him a house, but God said no. Solomon built the house for him. However, Elyon, or the Most High God, doesn't dwell in man-made houses. As the prophet says, heaven is my throne, the earth is the footstool of my feet. What kind of house will you build me? Says Adonai, or what is the place of my rest? Did not my hand make all these things? So again, what's his point? Here he comes to it. This is what gets him stoned. Here he gets to this point. He says, oh, you stiff-necked people, you uncircumcised of heart and ears, you always resist the Ruach, the Kodesh, just as your fathers did, you do as well. And that right there is real important line. You always resist the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh is the Holy Spirit. You always resist the Holy Spirit just as your fathers did. So why did he recount those stories? Why did he talk about Joseph being sold by his brothers? Because he was making that connection in that story, getting to this point at the end of his speech about how they have a history of God speaking through his prophets, through his Spirit. That's how it happens, through his Spirit. It happens in dreams, it happens in visions, and then they ignore it. They ignore what God has to say. They ignore everything he wants, he's trying to tell them. And then what? They kill them. It says, which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? Think about that. Joseph, they wanted to kill him for being a prophet, for having dreams. And yes, the dreams were conflated with this whole jealousy and dad's favoritism and, oh, we're bowing to you. And I understand that as well. I wouldn't want to hear anybody say, oh, I had a dream that you were worshiping me. Come on. But at the same time, if this is coming from God, which was their belief, like Joseph said, these things come from God, the interpretation, the meanings come from him. So if they understood it, it could be an easy dream to understand, but they did understand it. If they understood it, I should say, that understanding comes from God itself. So even in understanding it, they reject it. And that's what Stephen's accusing the leaders of Jesus' day of doing as well. Now you have become his betrayers and murderers, you who received the Torah, the teaching by the direction of angels, and did not keep it. Powerful, powerful stuff by Stephen. That's why this reading is given to us. I think they should have included these verses as well, so that, because most likely, some of you, or maybe most of you, didn't read all of it. So I encourage you to go back and look at it. But I would say this: if I was going to summarize all of this past week's teaching, uh, what is the takeaway for me as I studied it and I'm walking away, close up the study, and end the night, or in the afternoon, I should say, is that God still speaks. God, from the very beginning, has been speaking. Genesis chapter 1, and God said. He's been speaking and been speaking and been speaking. His mode of speaking has as we read through the book of Genesis, we see it grow. We assume, you read like Abram being called by God. We assume that God is standing right in front of Abram and it's like, oh, go get up and leave. We assume that. But as we go into the stories, I think we should look back on it and say, oh, most likely God was giving Abraham a dream or a vision. It's like a state of meditation, and you just kind of start to see like something that is in your mind's eye, not in reality. It's like in a spiritual realm. And in these moments, the Spirit of God works and He speaks and He shares truth. And He gives us these dreams. And it's really important for us to be able to take the time to, first of all, not dismiss them, write them down, share with other people, pray about it, and ask God, what are you trying to tell me? What are you saying? I struggle. I'm struggling to do this because I'm like, I don't know if I should, but man, I just keep hearing in my head like, share the dream, share the dream. So I'm going to do it because it's what God says we should be doing, right? If He speaks and He gives a dream, we should be speaking. The prophet, and I'm not saying that I'm a prophet. I think. Let me show you Acts chapter 2. Now we're going into extra time. So if you have to go home, you can go. This is something I used to tell my students in class. Like, obviously, if you're watching on YouTube, you can just pause it and pick up later. But in Acts chapter 2, Peter is preaching in verse 16. He says, but this is what's spoken through the prophet Joel, and it shall be in the last days, said God, that I will pour out my ruach, my spirit, on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your young men shall see visions. Your old men shall dream dreams. Even on my slaves, male and female, I will pour out my ruach in those days, and they shall prophesy. And then it goes into like the second part, what I consider the second part of that prophecy. And the reason why Peter is saying that, he says, we're not drunk, right? Earlier they were being accused of being drunk, and they could hear everybody speaking different languages. And what he's telling them is, it's only the third hour of the day. We're not drunk. This is just the fulfillment of the Spirit. And you notice again, what is he saying? The Spirit's going to come out on everybody. And they're going to be prophesying. They're going to have visions. They're going to have dreams. And it's just a fulfillment of what it means to be someone who's anointed or baptized in the Spirit, I should say. And so God gives dreams to us. And I had a dream before the election. I had a dream that had, President, former president, future president, President-elect Donald Trump was, standing in a field. The field was kind of like on a hill, and he was in the middle there, and there was like a podium, and going down the hill on every side, just surrounded by people that were wearing like these red color shirts. And so I just saw a lot of the color red. And then I saw a sign. I was kind of like floating on the out. There was like a fence around this field, and I was floating on the outside of it, and like kind of like from like a high view, and I was kind of rotating around. I was just like, well, what is this going on? And then I saw this name that I didn't know who it was, and it's like Tulsi, Tulsi Gabbard. I just remembered the spelling, so I wrote it down later, and then I looked it up and I saw who she is and everything else. But what I saw was they were all like kind of up. All the people were like it's almost like they were like worshiping him, and then all of a sudden the ground started shaking and it opened and everybody started to collapse into it. And so when I woke up, this was before the election, and I was like, "Whoa, that's." I told my wife the dream, and I still don't know like what I knew it didn't mean that he was going to lose the election or anything. I just felt like, so what does this mean? There is like a certain worship of this person that in my spirit sits wrong. There's this worship in defense of him that in my spirit as I see it happen is idolatrous. And the reason like I hesitate to even say anything is because of how strongly people worship him. And so there is a kind of a fear like if I say this there are going to be people who are mad at me. But you know what? Like he's not my God, and I guess we don't have the same God either if that's the case. And so what I saw was like he had this exaltation, but then this sudden collapse. And I think that's what God was trying to tell me, and I think that's what He wants me to share with whoever listens. Let him listen, like kind of like what Jesus was saying. Like this person seems to be lifted up, but there's going to be a collapse in His power, or whatever it is that brings them all together and up to this high place. And so I would caution any of you who are caught up in this fervor for this person because it's going to collapse. And I think God putting me on this place from the outside, I think it was very telling because that's always where I've been when it came to American politics and just in general, those kinds of subjects that are very much about this world and the power in this world. I've always kind of been on the outside looking at it and trying to understand it, but in the perspective where I'm trying to understand it from God's view, not mine. And just being up there, I saw this happen. I said, you know what? Woke up, told my wife, I've told a handful of people this dream privately, but now I'm like putting it out there. So I don't know, I know there's like 40 to 50 people who watch this on a regular basis. Maybe, so, you're going to be upset and not watch anymore. It's fine. I don't know. Maybe more people will hear it. But all I know is after doing this week's study, it's time for me to stop hiding or keeping to myself the things that God is telling me. I need to be responsible to share what He's speaking on in these dreams that I have with whoever might hear. Because the prophets of the old days, they didn't have the luxury of choosing who they shared with, right? Like, oh, I'm only going to talk to this person. I'll only talk to this person. That way I don't get any trouble. No, they spoke to everybody. And while there were those who got upset with them and even killed them, as Stephen said, there would be those who listen and those who would heed the word of God and avoid the punishment that was oncoming. All right, so I think I'm done with this week. This is late. It's Friday already. I'm going to post tonight. The next set of readings is just where we were traveling and with the jet lag, and then with Christmas in the middle of the week, it was really tough to get it all together. And I tried my best to get back on track early next week with the next video. But until then, God bless. Be safe. If I don't, share again before New Year's, please be safe. Have a great time celebrating the new year. I always enjoy doing that. However you want to do that. You want to have a prayer meeting. You want to go to a party, whatever it is. Be responsible and remember what Joseph would ask himself. How could I do this thing that would be evil in the eyes of God and offend Him? And then make the right choice. Don't do it. Don't do it. All right. Thank you again for watching. God bless.